recording, but awesome. Well, hi everyone. I'm Celeste, she, her pronouns, joining you all from Tijagi, colonially known as Montreal, Quebec. And yeah, so today I'm going to be talking to you about how, not just how the Canadian federal elections work, but also how Canada's government in general works, because I've noticed a lot of people out here don't really know what's up. A lot of people are saying they're voting for Mark Carney, they're voting for Jagmeet, or unfortunately, they're voting for Pierre. But in those cases, we're talking about people who are voting for a political party or its leader without actually acknowledging how the system actually works. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about that. I'll just warn you all in advance that I'm a little bit sick today, so I'm going to be trying my best, but I might be a little bit slower than expected. So please forgive me for that. Do you see my screen correctly? Awesome. Does the slide change up here correctly? Awesome. Well, let's get started. So my presentation will be really pretty much in four parts. First, explain the division of powers within Canada and the Canadian, and afterwards the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which are two of the most foundational texts which exist here in Canada and which govern effectively how Canadian legislation works. And afterwards, talking about, key issues during this election. Afterwards, talking about how the Canadian federal elections work precisely, and then how to vote as a queer trans person. To first begin, the first thing we need to talk about is how Canada is a federal country. We're not a unitary state. And this means that we have different levels of government here in Canada. The details are going to be in the Constitution Act 1867. You might have also learned about it through history classes as the British North America Act 1867. And it was a tool of colonialism that very much, set up a lot of the oppression that many non-white folks, in particular Indigenous folks, have lived on this land for the last 150 something years. However, it's still important to acknowledge the fact that this law from 1867 still governs how things are divided between the federal government and your provincial one. So, for instance, under federal law, you have a lot of different things which, okay, damn, the photos here are not working. Give me a second so I can fix this up. Doesn't work like this. Sorry, just give me a sec. Tech issues. All right, there, now it works. So to explain, under federal law, a lot of different things which affect trans people are very much governed by it, but also a lot of other things as well. So for example, federal law controls citizenship and passports. So for example, that's why you have a Canadian passport and not an Ontario passport. It governs criminal law, which is why, for example, if you say you stole something in BC versus in Quebec, you'd pretty much be expected to get the same sentence. Indigenous affairs are governed under federal law, so is money and banking, air and marine transportation, international relations. So that's why, for example, we're seeing so much pressure being put on the federal government to oppose, say, the genocide in Gaza, amongst other things. Most of immigration is governed under federal law. The military as well, the postal service, and a lot of other things. But also just throw in the fact that the federal government collects in practice the bulk of taxes that you have to pay on income, amongst other things. So this means that the federal government has a lot more money than the provincial ones, which is why oftentimes you see federal laws being created to pay provincial governments money, which is how, for example, the federal government intervenes in healthcare. As for provincial law, I'd say the most important thing is that property and civil rights, quote unquote, is governed under provincial law. So, for example, in Ontario, it is legislative, the Legislative Assembly of Ontario and the Government of Ontario which takes care of that. In Quebec, it's the Government of Quebec and the Quebec National Assembly. In BC, it's the BC is the BC legislature, and so on. So this property and civil rights, this implies a lot of other things. For example, names, birth certificates, marriage certificates, etc. All of this falls under property and civil rights. So it's an extremely broad term which has been applied to a ton of things. And basically, that's why name changes are governed under provincial law, amongst other things, which is why it's also so important to watch out when it comes to provincial elections and not just federal ones. Same goes for administration of justice, for education, for healthcare, for some matters as it pertains to immigration, for most municipal affairs, in fact, highways, local transport, some social programs, etc. All this is under provincial law. So to give you a few examples, the lack of rent caps on new residential buildings in Ontario. I'm going pretty far away from the topic today, but just to give an example, one of the reasons why rent has been exploding in Ontario is the lack of rent caps, which means that new buildings being built in Ontario since 2018 are not subject to rent caps, which means that a landlord can jack up rent as much as they want every year. And this is owing to a law passed by the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party and not the federal Liberals. So if you see someone blaming Justin Trudeau for high rents in Ontario, it might be misplaced. So that's just one example. And a quick note on municipalities as well. Cities are governed by provincial governments, and provincial governments create the laws which dictate what cities do. Which is why, for example, the law to remove bike lanes off, say, Yonge in Toronto and University Avenue, these actually stem from the Ontario government, the Ontario legislature, trying to impose its will on the city of Toronto. And it's able to do so precisely because of the fact that cities are managed by provinces and not by the federal government. And now back to federal government. And why is this election so important for trans people in Canada? So, most broadly speaking, the federal government has a fairly large authority over everything as it pertains to just civil rights in Canada. Most importantly, I'd say you should look out for these words here. Make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Canada. This section actually goes into like 20, 30-ish subparagraphs, so it's pretty long. But for short, the Parliament of Canada has control over a lot of things, which basically everything which provinces do not control. So I'm going to go a little bit more details here. And for trans folk, some key examples here. First, it's your civil rights. It's your ability to make decisions on behalf of yourself, make decisions concerning your own body, and also just making sure that your civil rights are defended. He put a picture of Henry Morteller, who fought to make abortion, which is ending a pregnancy, legal all across Canada. The reason why it was not legal until 1988 was because of a federal law prohibiting abortions in most cases. So Henry Morteller here sued the government and won. But civil rights, once again, is under control of the federal government, and the federal government could take action to go against this, which I'm going to go into in a little bit. Some identification documents are also under federal jurisdiction. Most importantly, it's a Canadian passport. So the very ID you need in order to travel outside of Canada, because it's pretty much impossible to do so without this, now that there's no longer there's pretty much no more alternative documents that you can obtain without a passport. The same goes for social insurance numbers and other, key elements which are used to identify people in Canada, which means that if, say, there's a law prohibiting gender marker changes on a Canadian passport, the same way as in the US, it affects everyone all across Canada. And finally, a lot of public affairs as well. Like, for example, trans Americans fleeing the US, fleeing to Canada for their own safety. That's something which will likely make them subject to federal law because everything as it pertains to whether it be the US-Canada so-called Safer Country Agreement, or if it's as it pertains to just asylum, like refugee law in general, immigration law, most of this falls on the federal government as well. So if you want to stand in solidarity with trans Americans, this federal election matters. And these are just a few examples here. We can also talk about housing programs, like for example, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. There's also so many more things which are all employment insurance as well. So many other things which are subject to federal control, which are not necessarily trans-specific, but very much do affect trans lives, and which disproportionately affect lower income folks living in Canada. So just giving this as an example. Now, probably the cornerstone of this presentation, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is actually one of the most important parts of Canada's Constitution, which is its basic law, its most foundational law. So any law which runs contrary to this charter here is invalid. This means that every civil right protected by this is guaranteed to be protected in almost all circumstances. And the only way a government can actually, one of the only ways a government can actually not respect one of these civil rights if it's justified in a free and democratic society, which is a burden of proof which falls onto the government. This applies both to the federal government as well as provincial governments. So your charter here protects a lot of different civil rights. I put here a few examples, most notably fundamental freedoms. For example, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, belief, expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. All this means that you're able to protest if, say, if the government's doing something wrong. Every single protest, say, whether it be a protest for trans rights, even your local pride parade, all of this can only exist thanks to this part of the Canadian Charter. Because if it were not for that, it could be subject to as much repression as you can imagine, but it'd be perfectly legal. It also encompasses democratic rights, which are rights that you have as a citizen of Canada, which is most notably to vote in an election of members of the House of Commons, which is exactly what this federal election is about, or for Legislative Assembly, which means voting in a provincial election, and to be qualified for membership therein, which means to be a candidate for such an election. So of course, with that comes like needing to associate yourself with a party, amongst other things. You have legal rights. These are civil rights which primarily exist to protect you from state interference. So basically to protect you from politicians. First and foremost, you have a right to life, liberty, and security as a person. This most notably means that you have a right to, like, say, not be killed by your government, which is a pretty big deal. Also, everyone has a right not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned. If you think about all the Venezuelans deported, including refugee claimants, deported from the US to El Salvador, it's because this civil right, the right not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned, was completely stripped away from them. Same goes for Section 7 here. So this would never pass in Canada if the Charter were to apply. So that's why these civil rights are so important. It allows judges and other people, empowered to say, no, this is unacceptable. You also have protection against cruel and unusual treatment. So for example, that's why torture is prohibited in Canadian law. That's why you cannot be waterboarded by the police. I know I'm giving some extreme examples here, but trust me, if you've ever been to a fairly violent protest in the past, you know what I mean. And finally, I'd say the most important part of all of this, equality rights. I'll read it out loud for you. Every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law, without discrimination and, in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. You might ask yourself, does that protect queer and trans people? The answer is yes. And the reason why is because here, in particular, this provision here is the cornerstone to everything as pertains to equality in Canada. It's why queer and trans folk have been able to not just advocate, with the governments, etc., in order to make sure that queer and trans folk can be protected, from oppression, but also be able to sue government in order to say, we do not accept being oppressed. So it's a pretty big deal. It means that any civil rights violation, any attempt at denying us our fundamental freedoms, our ability to exist, all of that's something which we can contest ourselves. In practice, there are, of course, a lot of limitations, like, for example, having to find a competent lawyer, etc. But still, the possibility thereof is already a big deal. And just some more concrete examples. Your charter protects the right to unionize and to strike. your freedom over your reproductive choices, which means, for example, to have children or not to have children. It also implies legal anti-discrimination protections for both like queer folks on the basis of your sexual orientation, as well as trans people. It also means legal protection from unjust state practices, most notably random roadside stops, for example, instances of racial profiling, and the death penalty. And also, it protects certain principles in law. For example, the principle of the best interest of the child and the mature minor doctrine, which have been used in order to allow trans kids access to gender-affirming healthcare without parental consent when they're able to consent themselves. Same goes as pertains to COVID-19 vaccines and many other forms of politicized healthcare. So, yeah, you have a lot of protections. And in good part, it's because of this very charter, which, by the way, has only existed since 1982. It's only existed for 43 years up to now, and it pertains to equality rights only for 40 years. So you might have parents or folks from prior generations, grandparents, who never grew up knowing that their rights would be protected. Of course, for some folks, it's less of a big deal, especially if you're part of the self-defined majority, as I like to call it. But for anyone who is not part of this so-called majority, the very fact of having civil rights makes an enormous difference. And yeah, so charter court cases, they usually end up in front of a judge or judges who then interprets, so reads the charter, and basically just helps understand what is protected. But yeah, you have a lot of protections. Now, what is not protected? This is why this election is so damn important. Because of the fact that many of our provincial governments did not feel comfortable in the 1980s to have, their ability to legislate be set aside and put towards judges. And because Alberta, being Alberta, wanted, an exception to the fact that its civil rights might be taken away, you have here an exception, an escape clause. That's what we call a notwithstanding clause. So Parliament or the legislature of a province may expressly declare in an act of Parliament or of the legislature, as case may be, that the act or provision thereof shall operate notwithstanding a provision included in sections 2 or 7 to 15 of this charter. So you might see all these civil rights here, fundamental freedoms, legal rights, equality rights, all of this. Poof, as soon as you include that clause here, it's all gone. The clause is designed to be used primarily for the period of only one legislature, which means that there's a 5-year limitation. The Canadian Charter does prescribe a five-year term limit for every government, but in practice, by law, it's every 4 years. But yeah, so declaration made under Section 1 shall cease to have effect 5 years after it comes into force. But the thing is, this was introduced with like an understanding, which might have been true at the time, that any civil rights violation under this charter would be seen so impermissible by the general public that they'd vote the government out, that they would never accept this to happen. But unfortunately, that has not been true. Whether it be with Ontario. So I'm sure you remember the strikes. I believe it's teacher strikes back in 2022. Yeah, teacher strikes back in 2022. The Ontario government used the notwithstanding clause in order to force these teachers to go back to school and teach. It was only because of the threat of a general strike by the unions that the government backed down. But that was one lucky example. What about in Quebec? We have here Bill 21, a bill which forbids teachers from wearing hijabs, which forbids teachers from wearing any religious symbol, quote unquote, but in practice, which is used primarily to target Muslim women. Same goes for a bunch of other positions in the Quebec public service. It's been contested in the courts for the last 5-6 years now. Litigation still in the works. It's currently pending at the Supreme Court of Canada. But in the meantime, the Quebec Coalition Avenir Quebec government did not lose any seats during the last provincial election, 2022. Instead, it gained even more seats. So basically, it got a benefit from from removing civil rights from Muslim women, amongst other protected groups. And in Saskatchewan, for trans kids, a law forcing trans kids to be misgendered unless they accept to be outed towards their parents accept to use their chosen name. That law contains a notwithstanding clause. And that and yet the Saskatchewan Party got re-elected last year with less seats, but still re-elected with a majority, so still able to pass to invoke the same legislation demonizing trans kids and putting them in danger. So you can tell how scary this is. And now the conservatives want to use the notwithstanding clause at the federal level. This would be a first in Canada. Pierre Poilievre says here we want to use the notwithstanding clause in order to keep multiple murderers locked up. But here in Canada, we have a principle when it comes to human rights. No one becomes an unperson. No one loses their civil rights, no matter what, unless they're dead. This means that even the worst person out there, even the multiple murderer, has civil rights under Canadian law, which are protected. But when it comes to, but if this starts getting used, this means that the federal government can decide who is a person deserving of civil rights and who is not. It might start with multiple murderers, but what about, say, this gets used in order to recriminalize abortion in Canada? Or what if it gets reused in order to criminalize gender-affirming care across the country? It'd be the same damn thing as the US. And the worst part is, in Canada, apart from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I just presented, we don't really have any other civil rights protections. In the US, technically, the courts have, different amendments to the US Constitution, which are seen as a Bill of Rights, which it can, nonetheless try to enforce. But here in Canada, the courts are powerless, which means basically, if the federal government is allowed to use the notwithstanding clause, you can say goodbye to every civil right we've earned here in Canada in the last 40 years. Every single civil right. That includes the right to marriage for all, to an abortion, to gender-affirming healthcare in many cases, and so much more. I hope I've already convinced you all that Poilievre's platform is anything but feminist. In the meantime, do any of you have questions or thoughts, etc., before I move on to the next part of my presentation? I don't see any hands, so I'll continue. Now about the Canadian federal elections. So Canada's legislature is actually divided in two different houses. So you have the House of Commons and the Senate. I'll begin with the Senate by just saying that they are an unelected body of people who mostly just are appointed by the government, who is meant to be basically a committee of quote-unquote wise people to analyze laws in a relatively sober quote-unquote way. So this is what technically it's supposed to be about. That's the Senate. The Senate is not subject to elections. So laws do need to pass both the House of Commons and the Senate in order to become a law at the federal level. The House of Commons, though, this is what's under election right now. The House of Commons is composed of 343 MPs, members of parliament, who decide what legislation gets passed in the country. As a group, the House of Commons basically has almost the utmost authority here in Canada to create new laws, to make new decisions, etc. So, got a lot of power here. And this is what's being elected right now. This is what matters. And the House of Commons, in practice, since it was first created, has been divided in political parties. The current ones that are most active in Canada are the Liberal Party, which is currently outgoing with a minority government, the Conservatives, which is the official opposition, which means the party with the second most amount of seats. The Bloc Québécois, which is a Quebec regional party, which advocates for Quebec interests ostensibly. The New Democratic Party, which is basically Canada's like leftist party, and the Green Party of Canada. You also have a few independent MPs who are not affiliated with a given party. Note how every single one of these boxes is a seat, which means that every single box here, it's one representative. It's one person. So and each person here, each seat represents a riding, which can be small, which can be large. So I put two examples here of outgoing MPs. Marcy Ian, who was formerly our Minister of Women and Gender Equality here in Canada, represents up until this current election, Toronto Centre for the Liberal Party. So she's a member of the Liberal Party, representing the Liberal Party, but she as a person, so Marcy Ian here, is the representative for this area. And you can see just how small this area is. I don't think it even goes to Yorkville. So it's pretty small. But this is Toronto Centre over here. And here I have Charlie Angus, who is outgoing MP for Timmins, James Bay, which covers almost the bulk of northeastern Ontario here. So you can see a very large portion of territory. Each seat is meant to represent a certain amount of people, which means that usually if a space is less populated, you have less MPs per square kilometer or something along those lines. And you can see here Charlie Angus is a member of parliament for the NDP, but this does not mean that the NDP controls the riding. It's Charlie Angus who controls the riding. It's not, which means here the party actually is just merely the members' affiliation, which means that basically, say theoretically, if this was like before the elections, both these members of parliament decided to become independents, so to disaffiliate themselves from the party, they'd continue to sit as an independent. But say if they step down, the party cannot just reappoint a new person from the same party to the same riding. Instead, they must call a new by-election, which is basically a partial election for a given riding. So that's, for example, where like a by-election, like a partial election comes in. And what this means in practice is you won't be voting for a party leader. In practice, you'll hear a lot of people saying, I'm going to vote for Mark Carney. I'm going to vote for Jagmeet Singh. I'm going to vote for Elizabeth May. I'm going to vote for Pierre Poilievre in some unfortunate cases. You don't vote for those people. Instead, you are voting for a local candidate. So one of these folks here, for example, who may, though in practice almost always, be affiliated with a political party. That's what we call the Westminster model of government. It's how basically it's basically modeled after the British government, whereas every single seat there's one person there, and that person is affiliated with a political party. It's also why on the ballots, you can see how the political affiliation is much smaller than the person's name. It's because you're voting for the person themselves. Now about the Canadian federal elections. So the election proper is a process. It begins with calling the election. Usually this is a decision made by the Prime Minister of Canada, which just saying the Prime Minister of Canada is usually just one person designated by the party with the most seats, which means that because the Liberals here have the most seats, they get to decide who is Prime Minister of Canada. So Prime Minister can ask Governor General to dissolve Parliament, which means vacating Parliament, resetting to zero, and this means an election is called. After this, you have a period of time, usually between 1 to 2, maybe sometimes occasionally up to 2.5 months, I believe. So usually 1 to 2 months, where there's a campaign going on. And so there are laws and an independent body who handle elections. So you have the Canada Elections Act, which handles elections, but you have Elections Canada, which is a nonpartisan body designed to handle elections in their entirety. The elections occur all here up until election day. Election day is the final day where voting is open. It's usually the biggest day for the election. everyone goes to vote that day. You might have like a voter information card. You can go vote using this, you know. So yeah, so that's primarily what the election's about. You will have some days here in the middle, which are deadlines, for example, for candidates to register, as well as days for like special special ballot elections, voting in Elections Canada office, or voting through advanced voting. So for example, for students who might want to vote at the university campus or prisoners who in Canada are allowed to vote within their jail, these are people who these are all like ballots which are processed before election day. Also, election day is kind of meant to be like the general catch-all day for everyone else. Everyone is so when it comes to voting in Canada, one principle is that ballots are secret. Your ballot, nobody can ask you to tell who you voted for. It's secret if you choose it to be so. You also have access to here voting. You can see this is an Elections Canada booth, which means that when you vote, it's secret. No one is authorized to, no one is allowed to force you to disclose who you voted for. Voting, I know it's with a pen, so I know some folks are a little bit concerned about that, but the whole trick is to make sure that if there's eraser marks, that the eraser marks are visible. And in that case, the ballot is spoiled, which means it does not count. So basically, they use a pencil. In practice, it's a pretty thick one, but you can also use pens if you like. And the system here is a first past the post system, which means that whoever gets the most vote within a given riding, so for example, this is for South Surrey White Rock in BC, the MP with the most votes within a given riding wins the seat. Multiply that by 343 and get the composition of Parliament. So each one of these is one such race. So for example here, you notice how the Liberal plus the NDP vote is larger than the Conservative vote, but because the Conservatives got more votes overall, the Conservatives get the seat. And this, you can multiply it all across the country. So that's why you see like these big maps of different ridings all across Canada. It's all that. And I'm going to do a little parentheses about strategic voting. Again, it's a topic that's been addressed quite a bit by people who are not sure to know about. I put here a more extreme example. So this is in the Nanaimo Ladysmith, also in BC. The Conservatives here have 31%, plus or minus 7% of the vote. The Greens have 27, are projected to have 27%, the NDP 21%, the Liberals 20%. Here, the Conservatives would win. And that is despite the fact that the majority of electors, so 68% of the electors within this riding, are projected to vote for a party that is not the Conservatives, so a party which is a little bit more towards the left. What if everyone batted behind, for instance, Greens? You have this instead. We have 68% voting for the Greens instead of just 27%. So that is why people talk so much about strategic voting during these elections. It's because a lot of people are very concerned about the possibility of a given, of say, thing going really wrong. So you can see just how much more can a vote be if like everyone batted around the same party. In practice, a lot of folks talk about like going for the liberals, but this is not necessarily the case, and it's really a writing by writing question. So, for example, here for the Ladysmith, it might be, it might be for the Greens, but in a lot of Ontario writings, it might be for the liberals instead. For some, it might be the NDP, etc. And in some cases, it's not even necessary, and you can safely vote your conscience. And now, how do the parties stand on queer and trans issues? I put a big no sign over the conservative logo here. Usually you're not supposed to be very partisan, especially when it comes to nonprofit work. But I will say very clearly that the Conservatives are probably the only political party, and by far the worst, when it comes to queer trans issues. So I'm going to cite the Rainbow Equality campaign here, run by my friend Faye Johnstone, that Pierre has wading in the dangers of what he describes as quote unquote gender ideology, end quote. And amongst other things, this means that he is opposed to access to gender-affirming healthcare for young trans people, is only aware of two genders, quote unquote. It's the only leader to support Daniel Smith in Alberta's crusade against trans kids. Also has passed policy resolutions as a party. First and foremost, trying to propose banning trans women from women's spaces, for example, bathrooms. and barring access to gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth. Poilievre has also voted previously against marriage equality in 2005 and has tried to vote to reopen the marriage equality debate back when it was a debate in 2006, has also introduced petitions trying to repeal marriage equality as late as the early 2010s. So very much we're talking about someone who absolutely hates queer and trans people. Conservative Party has no commitment to advance equality. In their platform that was released today, there's 5 mentions of the word woman or women in their party platform. 3 of those mentions are concerning opposing trans women being women's prisons. Trans women are women. Come on. So more than half of the mentions of women used in the conservative platform are used specifically to target trans people, in particular trans women. So I'm not going to shy away from saying that the conservatives are dangerous towards trans youth. Of course, when it comes to the other parties, there are other ways to look up their platforms. So, for example, when it comes to Mark Carney, there's not really been that many statements about queer rights, but he's very much tried to emphasize upholding the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as he openly said during the English debate last week that the Charter exists to protect Canadians from politicians like himself, which honestly I do appreciate, and also has a platform which explicitly promotes the safety of queer people, maintaining safety for pride festivals, and providing extra funding for like community capacity within community organizations, among other things. You also have the NDP, which has, very much been very outspoken about trans people as well. The Green Parties, as well as the Green Party as well. So we're talking about quite a few folks who do stand for queer people within the Canadian electoral compass. Now, for the final part of this presentation, voting as a queer trans person. So, in general, if you want to vote, there's 3 requirements. You must first be a Canadian citizen. You must also be 18 years old as of the day of the election. So as of election day. This means, in this case, April 28th. And you must also be able to prove your identity and your address because you are voting within a given riding, which means a given, electoral district, and not, directly for a prime minister. If you're wondering, are you registered to vote or no? For this, usually if you check the box while you file your taxes, because if you file your tax with the CRA, it's going to allow you to automatically put your information into the Canadian Register of Electors. It means that you should be registered. If not, I'd suggest that you go early to the ballot box on April 28th in order to confirm that you're registered, or if not, register at the last minute. You also need to present the ID in order to register. So most notably, you're going to need to show a piece of ID that's contains your name and your address, or it can also be 2 documents containing your name and one containing your current address. So you can see here options 1 and 2. In practice, what it means is if you have an Ontario photo card or driver's license in a given province, or a photo card from any other province, let's say, with your address on it, you can just show up with that card and go vote. You will have to vote under the same name as your provincial ID, which means that if you have changed your name, you may need to update your ID before being able to change your name. Before being able to change your name with Elections Canada. You can also try using option 2 if you've already updated your name elsewhere as well, but name updates do need to be put in consideration here. As for address changes, always use your current address if you can. As for option 2 here, it could be, for example, a bank statement plus your voter information card, because this will contain an address and your name in both instances. So this will also already allow you to vote, which can make things simpler. If you want to go with option 2 here, both names need to be the same, which means that if you've changed on some documents, you need to make sure that you use both documents being the same. So yeah, here, your ID name must match your voter registration, or your legal gender, and your peers don't need to match your ID. You can always update your name on site if you have a change name certificate. Now you can also ask people at the elections office to use your chosen name, even though it will probably not be recorded, unfortunately. And as a little reminder too, before I open it up for questions, I want to just remind you all that elections can come down to a razor thin wire. There are some writings here, and most of them are, these are like some writings in the last federal elections in 2021, which came down to 250 votes or less in terms of the difference. Most notably here in Shadowgate, which is near where I live in Tijage, so near Montreal, the Liberals won by only 12 votes. So don't think that your vote does not matter, because your vote does. Every vote makes a difference here. Every vote is one person. If 12 people more showed up for the bloc here, the bloc would have won. And same goes in so many other cases too. So definitely don't think that your vote is useless. Go vote. It's important. It's your civic duty on top of that, that not everyone across the globe can benefit from, but yet still allows you to at least have a stake in preventing the conservatives from getting elected if you're afraid of their anti-trans policies, or vice versa. If in that case, you probably wouldn't be here. Democracy can never be taken for given. Every time someone said, well, I know we talked so much about Trump today. I know it's scary, but I want to be very honest. We do live right now in a time when fascism is on an unprecedented rise. There are many trans people who have moved from the US to Canada already in an attempt to flee this guy here, to flee anti-trans policy. There's even some people, who've crossed into Ontario, into Canada, and claimed refugee status. American citizens, refugees in Canada, because of Trump's anti-trans policies. I don't want this to happen here. I don't want such a thing to happen here. I want us to be able to thrive. I want us to be able to live. And it's going to come down to who votes who in today. It's going to come down to who votes next Monday. That's going to decide who, how our future is as a country. And I'm scared. I'm sure many of you all are scared as well. But the first thing you can do is at least talk about it. Talk to people around you. Tell them that your civil rights are in danger. If you're unsure about it, I'm going to pull up the conservative platform right here so you can see exactly the anti-trans parts that I'm referring to. Sorry, give me a sec here. You can see I'm not speaking out of a lie here in the middle. So yeah, let's not take our civil rights for granted, because that's been a mistake made way too many times in the past. I don't want people to continue making that mistake, because that is exactly what puts democracy in jeopardy. It's when we pretend that our civil rights can be taken for granted. They're not. It's up to us all to hold them up together. So yeah, let's keep Canada safe for all. Question period time. Benji, can you end the recording really quickly?
Sorry about that.